I don't know if you guys are all aware of this, but this is Women's History Month. And this happened to be one of the lectionary texts. Actually, it was a lectionary text for 3 weeks ago, but I realized that two people were speaking in front of me, so I've been sitting on this one for a while. But I think it's appropriate. Not only that, I've entitled this sermon, Jesus and the Shameful Woman, which is provocative, but not true. I love the song, Looking for Water from a Deeper Well. I did not know that song was coming, and I don't know if Emily Harris was thinking of this lady when she wrote it, but it very well could have been. The title of the talk is intentionally provocative, and as you'll see here in a moment, not true. It captures something that gets missed almost every time the story is read. Jesus talks longer to this woman than anybody else in the Gospels. He talks to her in one particular sitting longer than to his disciples, to his accusers, to his own family, to anyone. And that alone should cause us to pause and to really pay attention. We need to understand who this woman actually was. She has been consistently misread in both preaching and commentaries. Every time I've heard this story taught, the main focus was that she was an immoral adulteress, a woman of rough history and bad reputation. Quote unquote, even a woman like her can be saved, I would hear. I want to suggest to you that we have good reason to challenge that interpretation. The way this story has typically been told reveals far more about our own cultural assumptions than it does about the text itself. And so I'd like to take a peek at that. And we'll start with her, because she is actually the co-star in this story. The first thing we need to know about her is she was a Samaritan. And that was not completely a ethnic footnote. This is actually centuries of mutual contempt compressed into a single word. It's a word that's freighted with some sort of negative connotation. One writer puts it this way: the Jewish people of Jesus' day looked with disdain upon Samaritans, whom they considered heretics and half-breeds, the products of remnant Israelites commingling with Assyrian invaders centuries earlier. To Jesus' original audience, a Samaritan was the absolute other, whom any smear could be said because everyone just knew it was true. We have to note what John's parenthetical thought, and it's written as a parenthetical thought by the commentator. It says in verse 9, the Samaritan woman said to him, "You are a Jew, and I'm a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" And it's as if John inserts a statement, and he says, "For Jews do not associate with Samaritans." His note is crucial to the entire story that follows. Here's the second thing that we know about this person, is she is a woman in a patriarchal world. She's a woman, is obvious in the text, but profoundly consequential to our understanding of what's going on. The disciples' reaction later on in the passage, in verse 27, indicates that they were astonished that Jesus was hanging out with a woman. She says, "I'm a Samaritan woman," and all of a sudden the disciples come back and they see him talking to her, and they're a little bit shocked. It says in verse 27, just then his disciples returned and were surprised to find him talking to a woman. But no one asked, "What do you want?" or "Why are you talking with her?" Jewish culture in the first century was decidedly patriarchal. As one writer puts it, the daily prayers of Jewish men included this prayer of thanksgiving: "Praised be God that he has not created me a woman." That could be said by Christians today, I suppose, some of them. Men were not to greet women in public. Some Jewish writers of Jesus' time, such as Philo, taught that women should never leave the home except to go to synagogue. I hope that feels shocking to all of us. Lastly, I'm going to say that she is, and this is inferred, and I'll explain it to you, she is a survivor. She is a survivor in the story. When Jesus asks her about her husband, most people I have heard teach on this text see it as a gotcha moment. Jesus catching her in her dishonesty, exposing her immorality. This is what the text actually gives us. Pay attention. He told her, "Go call your husband and call back." "I have no husband," she replied. Jesus said to her, "You are right when you say you have no husband. The fact is you've had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have said is quite true." Now, it is difficult to pull out any edge of moralizing in this text. Jesus doesn't condemn her. Jesus does not lecture her. He does not judge her. He simply clarifies what's going on, very much like the woman caught in adultery later on in the Gospel of John, in chapter 8. You guys know the story. It's a woman who's been caught by religious leaders in the very act, it says, of adultery. They bring her into the square, and they ask Jesus, "What should we do?" And Jesus does the bit about writing in the sand, and one by one it says they all walked away, and this is the crux of the story. Jesus turns to her and says, "Woman, where are your accusers?" What does she say? "I have none." And Jesus says, "I do not accuse you either. Go and sin no more." If we can be honest, we know very little about this woman. It's just a little bit of information we have, but we do know a great deal about the culture that she lived in relationship to women. In that world, a woman could not have acquired 5 husbands by her own choosing. That was not within her rights. She could not initiate divorce. Now, I'm speaking like this is, I get the whole story. There's some speculation here, and some people speculate that Jesus is challenging her in relationship to these men, and that she could have been an adulterer, but I don't see that in the text necessarily. She could not initiate the divorce on her own. If she were an adulteress, she could have been potentially stoned in that era. She could have been killed by that. Men, on the other hand, could write a woman a writ of divorce for almost any reason. Anything that the man thought, he could divorce the woman. Jill Eileen Smith observes, in her culture, her husbands would have had to either die or divorce her. A woman could not just leave a marriage. If she committed adultery, she could have been stoned. But 5 men were married to her, so either she was the ultimate black widow or these men divorced her. The man she lives with now is most likely, and I would assume this, her only viable option for survival, because women in that era could not survive without a covering of some kind, a male covering. Without her husband, women were devastatingly vulnerable. They were impoverished, entirely dependent on male provision and protection. We have to understand that. It reminds me of some of the language of Howard Thurman in his incredible book, Jesus and the Disinherited, where he talks about the impoverished spirit of the African American in the U.S. He writes this: "Fear is one of those persistent hounds of hell that dog the footsteps of the poor, the oppressed, and the disinherited." She was not a cautionary tale of moral failure. I don't believe that. She was a woman surviving within a system designed to consume women exactly like her. Okay, I'm going to do a little sidestep here. I'm going to use an excursus. That means I'm going to get particular about something that has to do with the larger story, and I want to drill down to contemporary culture and women's position there. It doesn't take an extensive Google search to recognize what's still going on in our country. This woman in our story had 3 strikes against her before Jesus ever spoke a word. She was a woman in a world where women were property, not persons. She was a Samaritan, despised and dismissed, considered unclean by the very people who claimed to worship God. We can find correlations in 2026 in many areas of the church. The implication was that because of her dependence on men, she was almost certainly vulnerable and poor. There was ethnic disparity, gender disparity, economic disparity. I hope you're going in your head right now, that sounds kind of familiar. It doesn't take much to suss this out. Though things have improved for women in our culture, the work of equality is far from complete. In 2024, American women, and this is an incredible increase from where it was a decade before that, they earn 84 cents to every man's dollar. And for women of color, 64% of every other male in the culture's dollar. Women hold, catch this, 29% of congressional seats, or actually any political seat, while they hold 51% of the electorate. They've never been president, as you all know. And only 10% of CEOs in our country are occupied by women, even though women have surpassed men for being educationally degreed in our country at this point. In a conversation with Sue this last week, it came to my awareness. I was reminded it wasn't until 1974, and I need to give you context. I was in high school in 1974. This is in my lifetime. A woman could not get her own bank account or credit card without a man's signature in 1974. Additionally, here's what should concern us all. Every one of the followers in this room of Jesus, as much or more, is that the church has too often been a mirror of that inequality rather than a critique. While most segments of society at least have made some progress, many churches, evangelical communities, I have to be specific, have remained unchanged, and some have actually regressed. And I won't name names. Do your own Google search. But there are full denominations that have gone backward. This is one of the reasons, honestly, we've affiliated with the ECC, or the Evangelical Covenant Church, is because in 1976, they began to ordain women. They are not where they should be. There's tons of work to be done still. But we have a woman president of our denomination, the Reverend Tammy Swanson, who's a brilliant leader and an amazing person. If I can be just a little prophetic for one moment, we'll get back to the text, I promise. I feel like this is where we all need to break out our WWJD bracelets again as a reminder. He didn't check her ethnicity. He did not discriminate by her gender. He asked her for water. He offered her living water, and he sent her as one of the first evangelists to her entire village. The one whom we speak about, we say all the time, the one who breaks every wall of separation, clearly demonstrated this in our passage today. It cannot be mistaken. He has broken down every wall. Unfortunately, the church keeps erecting walls. Look, my expectation level is lower for outside the church, but we need to judge ourselves in this situation. A question for us, his church, is whether we're willing to follow him now. Are we willing? Are we willing to be intentional about that? Okay, let me get back. The excursus is over. I'm going to get back to our text because I'm looking at the clock going, oh, they don't think I'm going to get back. The narrative tells us that Jesus was already at the well when she arrived. He was tired. He was exhausted. He had been traveling on his journey. His disciples had gone to town. He was sitting alone when she comes around the corner. Now, this is so important. He speaks first. It says in verse 7, when a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" That matters because in a single sentence, he breaks three distinct barriers: the ethnic barrier between Jew and Samaritan, the gender barrier that forbade Jewish men from addressing women in public, and the ritual purity barrier. Asking to drink from a Samaritan's vessel violated Jewish law. She names it immediately, and he doesn't back down. He offers her instead what he calls living water, or water from a deeper well. In verse 10 it says, if you knew the gift of God, the gift of God and who it is who asked you for a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. She's practical at first, before she says immediately, you don't even have a bucket. I don't know if she did that kind of funny, but when I read it, I went, oh, yeah, this seemed a little bit humorous, but something in the offer reaches her And she asks for it. And that asking itself, I think, is a gesture of faith. She doesn't fully understand what's going on yet. But you know what? She wants it. She wants that water. What happens next is the center of the story. Jesus demonstrates that he knows her life in full, and he stays. He doesn't recoil. He doesn't lecture. He doesn't use her as history, as evidence against her. He simply sees her. Church, many of you have experienced that, where you've been unseen, but it is obvious that there is a difference between being seen and being surveilled. Between being seen and being surveilled. She had been watched with suspicion her whole life. This was something else entirely. So she pivots hard. That's a word we're using in our house a lot when we want to change the subject. She pivots, and I love this, sir. The woman said, I can see that you are a prophet. But it wasn't a dodge. It wasn't like she's being evasive. Rather, she wasn't deflective. She engaged him, listen, theologically, which was a stretch. She raises the oldest dispute between Samaritans and Jews. Where's the proper place to worship? Church, this is not an evasion. This is a woman whom seemingly has been thinking about God her entire life. Jesus takes her seriously, and he answers her directly. She responds, and she says, I am he. In verse 26, I, the one who's speaking to you, is Messiah. Because she says, when the Messiah comes, he'll explain all this. And Jesus says, I'm he. He says this to her, not to the Pharisees, not to Nicodemus, who was in the chapter just before, not to the learned Jewish leaders who came to Jesus in secret by night. It says it is to a Samaritan woman who came to a well at noon to avoid the crowds. She is the first person in John's entire gospel to whom Jesus explicitly reveals his messiahship. That's not something that Jesus does, but he tells her, I am the Messiah. We have to make a note of that, church. This should recalibrate our entire view of the kingdom. This part is so important. So, back to the disciples who were traveling with him. When the disciples return, they say nothing, surprised but silent. The woman leaves. She came to draw water. She leaves without it, and she goes back to her community, telling them in verse 29, come see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Messiah? She didn't ask for permission from anyone. This reminds me of Rodney, where he says, it's better to ask forgiveness than permission. She didn't look for denominational credentialing to speak. No institutional sending. Just, I met someone. He knew my life and my history. He saw me, something that hasn't happened in my lifetime, and everything changed. Come and see. By the way, this is not the first time this was used. And we see other examples in the New Testament of Jesus reaching people, and they go to their friends, they come and see. An example is from John 1. Jesus finds Philip, says to him to follow him. Philip then finds his close friend Nathanael and says to him, we have found the one Moses wrote about in the law, about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. Then Nathanael skeptically says, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Philip, at this point, simply says to his friend the same thing as the Samaritan woman said to her village or her community, come and see the Messiah for yourself. And they did. The result of this woman's testimony is remarkable, and I'm going to read you a larger section here, and it's kind of broken up, but you'll get why I'm doing this. It says in chapter 4, verse 39, many of the Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. We no longer believe just because of what you said. Now we have heard for ourselves. We know that this man really is the Savior of the world. I love this. She becomes the harbinger of faith for an entire community, not despite her history, but because of what she had just experienced. She gave her testimony, come and see. Many have mischaracterized Christianity as a continuation of the othering of women. While a patriarchal approach to the Christian faith sadly still exists in the church, it is extremely difficult. Listen, it's extremely difficult to arrive there if your journey goes through the actual life of Jesus. The church has too often assumed that this woman came to the well as a cautionary tale, left as a charity case, a sinner saved, a project completed. That is not what happened here. Jesus crossed every line of culture the culture had drawn. This is the center of the story. Ethnic, gendered, ritual, social, and engaged a woman who had spent her entire life being unseen except when being judged. She came thirsty, not just for water, but for dignity, belonging, and the experience of being fully known without being abandoned, much like some of us. That's the way we've come to Jesus too. Jesus knew everything and he stayed. He didn't walk away. She was not the shameful woman from the title that I started. I need to make that very clear because I've already been challenged on that a few times. I was being provocative. She was not that person. This is who she is. She's our sister. She's our sister. She's a real person. She's our sister in the faith. Not marginalized from the faith, but commissioned as a messenger. Not purposeless, but the first evangelist in John's gospel. The one who came seeking water, left carrying something that didn't fit in a jug. A life changed, a life renewed. I don't know if you know this, but the Catholic Church has actually canonized her as a saint. Given her a new name, given her an actual name. And they lifted her up. I think it's time for the Protestant church to come to our senses and realize that this is not the person that's been cast before us. Church, this is what Jesus does. He doesn't just save people, he commissions them. He commissions us. He doesn't merely rescue the marginalized, he sends them to make a difference in the world. In this case, he sends a vulnerable Samaritan woman to be the first herald of his identity as Messiah in the entire community that came to believe because of her impacted life and her personal testimony of belief. I was going to end the sermon right there, but I did say two more sentences. So I wrote them down as I stopped on the way here and wrote them down, and this is what I have to say. Patriarchy must die. The church must preach the real Jesus, not the cultural manifested Jesus. He does it with women throughout the entire New Testament. This is not an exception, but not just women, but with the poor, with the disenfranchised, with the pariah, the tax collectors, and with normal seekers like most of the people in this room. He actually does that with us. And that is something we can rejoice about this morning. Would you pray with me? Lord, this is really important to us. It's really important to me. I pray that we as a church would have our eyes clear and our hearts open to see what you did when you spoke to this woman, and it was recorded for a reason. It wasn't just a story about a community coming to know you. It's a story about how you engage the other of culture. And God, please help us. Give us your grace that we might follow in your way. That we would honestly and humbly follow, regardless of the cost, regardless of what it might look like to others, that we would have our heart undivided in our followership. Please help us, Lord, by your grace, by your mercy. In Jesus' name, amen.